Welcome to the desert of eternal questions. Hey guys, welcome back. Or if you're new here, welcome for the first time. Either way, go ahead and get comfortable, dim those lights, maybe grab a pillow, put your phone on Do Not Disturb because honestly, you're not missing anything important on Twitter at 2 in the morning. Tonight, we're going to talk about one of history's most famous landmarks, something you've definitely seen in pictures, probably assumed you knew everything about,
Clear
and
the
almost
sand from the
certainly
sacred
have never
paws,
thought deeply
as you
about
command.
while trying to fall
Reveal its
asleep.
glory.
We're talking about the Great Sphinx of Giza. Now I know what you're thinking. The Sphinx? Really? That big cat-human thing sitting in the desert? What's there to say? It's old, it's big, it's missing a nose. But here's the thing. The Sphinx is weird. Like, genuinely strange in ways that historians and archaeologists still argue about. And tonight, we're going to float through all of that weirdness together, nice and slow, examining every bizarre detail, every unanswered question, and every theory that sounds too insane to be real, but might actually have a point. So, settle in. This is going to be a long one. And by the end, you'll either be peacefully asleep or staring at your ceiling wondering why no one can agree on when a giant stone lion was carved. Either outcome is fine. Let's start with the basics, because even the basics are contested, which should tell you everything you need to know about this monument. The Great Sphinx sits on the Giza Plateau in Egypt, which you probably knew. It's about 240 feet long and 66 feet tall, carved mostly from a single piece of limestone bedrock. Mostly. We'll get to that. It has the body of a lion and the head of a human, wearing what appears to be a royal headdress called a nemes. The face is heavily eroded, the nose is famously missing, and there's a weird little beard area that may or may not have had an actual beard at some point. We'll get to that too. Traditionally, Egyptologists say it was built around 2500 BC, during the reign of Pharaoh Khafre, who also supposedly built the second pyramid at Giza. The Sphinx faces directly east, staring at the sunrise for eternity, which is either deeply symbolic or just a practical choice because that's where the sun comes up. Academics love to debate which. But here's where it gets fun. Some people think it's way older, like thousands of years older. And some people think it wasn't built by Khafre at all. And some people think the head wasn't always a head, or at least that head. And literally no one knows for sure who destroyed the nose or why, although there are about 15 different theories, most of which contradict each other. So yeah, basics. Totally straightforward. The Sphinx doesn't have any original inscriptions on it identifying who built it or when, which is honestly kind of rude when you think about it. Ancient Egyptians loved putting their names on things. Pharaohs would slap their cartouches on anything that stood still long enough. Temples, obelisks, statues, probably furniture. If you built something impressive in ancient Egypt, you made sure everyone knew it was you. But the Sphinx? Nothing. Not a single hieroglyph from the Old Kingdom saying Khafre was here or property of Khufu, do not touch. The earliest written reference to the Sphinx that we have is from way later, more than 1,000 years after it was supposedly carved. It's called the Dream Stele, and it was placed between the Sphinx's paws by Pharaoh Thutmose IV around 1400 BC. The inscription tells a charming story about how Thutmose fell asleep in the shadow of the Sphinx while out hunting, and the Sphinx spoke to him in a dream, asking him to clear away the sand that had buried it up to its neck. In exchange, the Sphinx promised Thutmose would become pharaoh, which he did. So apparently, dream career advice from limestone monuments actually works. But here's the thing. The Dream Stele is damaged right at the part where it might have mentioned who originally built the Sphinx. There's a partial cartouche that some people think says Khafre, but it's so eroded that it could also say Khufu, or possibly something else entirely, or maybe it's just a random scribble. Egyptologists have been arguing about this for decades. Some say it clearly references Khafre. Others say that's wishful thinking and circular reasoning. It's like trying to read a doctor's handwriting after it's been left out in the rain for 3,000 years. So why do most scholars think Khafre built it? Well, mostly because of proximity and stylistic guesses. The Sphinx is right near Khafre's pyramid and his valley temple. The face of the Sphinx, according to some researchers, kinda sorta resembles statues of Khafre, although the face is so worn down that this is basically like saying a blob of melted wax looks like your cousin. And there's a temple right in front of the Sphinx called the Sphinx Temple, because archaeologists are very creative with names, and it's built in a similar style to Khafre's Valley Temple, using some of the same types of stone. But none of that is definitive proof. It's circumstantial. It's vibes-based archaeology, and plenty of researchers have pointed out that just because something is near something else doesn't mean they were built at the same time by the same person. That's like assuming your neighbor built your house because you both have driveways. Now, let's talk about the weathering, because this is where things get properly weird. In the 1990s, a geologist named Robert Schoch made a lot of Egyptologists very upset by suggesting that the erosion patterns on the Sphinx indicated it was much older than the 2500 BC date. Schoch looked at the deep vertical erosion on the Sphinx's body and the walls of the enclosure around it and said basically that looks like water erosion, not wind erosion, which would be fine, except that the Giza Plateau hasn't had that kind of sustained rainfall since before 7000 BC, back when the Sahara was actually green and wet. If Schoch is right, that would make the Sphinx at least 9,000 years old, possibly older, which would mean it predates dynastic Egypt by thousands of years. This would also mean it was carved by a civilization we don't know about, during a time period we generally think of as pre-civilizational, at least in that region. You can imagine how well this went over with traditional Egyptologists. The counter-argument is that the erosion could have been caused by wind and sand combined with chemical weathering from moisture in the rock itself, plus occasional flooding from the Nile, plus general degradation over thousands of years. Basically, you don't need ancient rainstorms to explain it. You just need time and the usual suspects of geological decay.
But Schoch doubled down. He pointed out that other structures on the Giza Plateau from the same supposed time period, made of the same limestone, don't show the same weathering patterns. The pyramids, for example, have sharp edges and much less erosion, even though they're supposedly the same age. The Sphinx looks like it's been through a car wash repeatedly, while the pyramids look like they were built last Tuesday. Of course, the pyramids were also covered in smooth casing stones for most of their existence, which protected them, and those casing stones are mostly gone now, stolen over the centuries by people who wanted free building materials, so comparing the erosion directly is tricky. Also, the Sphinx is carved from the bedrock, meaning it's part of the ground, sitting in a pit exposed to water pooling and runoff in a way the pyramids never were. So maybe the weathering is just because it's basically sitting in a stone bathtub for 5,000 years. Schoch and his supporters say that doesn't fully explain it. Mainstream Egyptologists say it absolutely does explain it, and Schoch is a geologist, not an Egyptologist, so he should stay in his lane. Schoch says geologists know rocks better than Egyptologists do, which is fair, and round we go. The debate got even spicier when Graham Hancock and Robert Bauval jumped in, suggesting that the Sphinx might be part of some grand astronomical alignment connected to the constellation Leo, and that it was built by an advanced lost civilization around 10,000 BC. Most academics dismiss this as pseudoscience. Hancock and Bauval say most academics are closed-minded and afraid of challenging the paradigm. It's all very dramatic for a field that mostly involves dusting off pottery. Here's where I land on it, for what it's worth, which is nothing because I'm just a voice in your headphones at night. The weathering argument is interesting. It does look different from other structures, but looks different isn't the same as proof. And there's no archaeological evidence of a sophisticated civilization in Egypt capable of carving a giant limestone monument before 7000 BC. No tools, no settlements, no pottery, no art, nothing. Just the Sphinx itself, sitting there being mysterious. Which means either we're missing a huge chunk of history, which is possible, but would require some very convenient gaps in the archaeological record, or the weathering has a more mundane explanation that we just haven't fully figured out yet. Personally, I think the boring answer is usually right. But I also think it's fun that we don't actually know for sure. Uncertainty is cozy. Let it wash over you. Let's move on to the head, because the head is weird too. If you look at the Sphinx, really look at it, the proportions are off. The head is too small for the body. It looks like someone stuck a regular human head on a lion the size of a bus. Art historians and sculptors have pointed this out for years. In Egyptian art, proportions were usually very deliberate and symbolic. They didn't just randomly make things the wrong size. So why is the head so tiny? One theory, proposed by a researcher named Robert Temple, is that the head was recarved. Maybe the Sphinx originally had a full lion's head proportional to its body, and at some point, someone came along and re-sculpted it into a human face, which required making it smaller because you can't add stone back, you can only take it away. If that's true, it would explain the size issue. It would also raise the question of who did the recarving and why. Was it Khafre, turning an older monument into his own image? Was it someone earlier? Was the original Sphinx a giant lion symbolizing strength or the sun, or whatever lions symbolized before we had the internet to argue about it? Temple thinks the original Sphinx was carved around the same time as the rest of the Giza complex, but as a lion, and then later, maybe during Khafre's reign, the head was recarved to look like the pharaoh. This would explain why the head shows less weathering than the body, because it's technically younger, and why the proportions are wrong, because it's a revision. Other researchers think the head has always been a human head, just poorly executed or deliberately made smaller for some symbolic reason we don't understand. Maybe the small head represents humility. Maybe it represents the human intellect guiding the power of the lion. Maybe the sculptor just had a bad day. We don't know. There's also the question of whose face it is. If it's Khafre, great, that supports the traditional dating. But some people think it looks more like Khufu, Khafre's father, who built the Great Pyramid. Some people think it doesn't look like either of them. Some people think it might be a god, not a pharaoh at all. The face is so eroded that it's basically a Rorschach test at this point. You can see whatever you want. Forensic artists have tried to reconstruct what the face might have looked like originally, but they're working with a lot of guesswork. The nose is gone, obviously. The lips are damaged. The ears are mostly intact but weathered. The eyes are deep set and blank. It's like trying to identify someone from a potato that's been left in the sun for a few millennia. Some researchers have used photogrammetry and computer modeling to compare the Sphinx's face to known statues of Khafre. Their results are inconclusive. Some models suggest a resemblance, others don't. It depends on which statue you're comparing it to, which angle you're using, and how generous you're feeling about what constitutes a match. In 2004, a team of forensic experts compared the Sphinx to a famous statue of Khafre and concluded they were probably not the same person. The facial proportions were different, the bone structure didn't match. Of course, other experts looked at the same data and said, actually, it's close enough considering the erosion and the fact that ancient sculptors weren't working from photographs. So, once again, we're back to maybe. Here's a fun detail. The Sphinx has traces of red pigment on its face. At some point, possibly originally, it was painted. Imagine that, a giant red-faced lion human staring at the sunrise. We don't know if the whole thing was painted or just parts of it. We don't know what other colors might have been used, but it definitely wasn't the pale sandy color it is now. It was vibrant, loud, probably a bit garish by modern minimalist standards. There are also traces of yellow and blue paint elsewhere on the body, suggesting the whole monument might have been a riot of color. The ancient world was way more colorful than we give it credit for. All those pristine white marble statues we picture, they were painted. Bright reds, blues, greens, golds. The Sphinx was probably the same, just a massive, gaudy, technicolor beast squatting in the desert. Over time, the paint wore off, the stone bleached in the sun, and we were left with the weathered beige version we know today. It's like finding out your grandparents were way cooler than you thought. Let's talk about the beard, because of course there's drama about the beard too. Between the Sphinx's paws, archaeologists found fragments of a ceremonial beard. Not a real beard, obviously, it's a statue, but a carved stone beard that was apparently attached to the chin at some point. These ceremonial beards were common in Egyptian royal iconography, symbolizing divinity and authority. Pharaohs wore them in life, gods wore them in art, and apparently the Sphinx wore one too. Some of the beard fragments are in the British Museum, because of course they are. The British Museum has a piece of everything. Other fragments are in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. Together, they suggest the beard was long and braided, projecting forward from the chin in the classic pharaonic style. The question is whether the beard was part of the original design or added later. If it was original, it supports the idea that the Sphinx was always meant to represent a pharaoh or a god, not just a lion. If it was added later, it suggests the monument was repurposed or reinterpreted at some point. Most scholars think the beard was a later addition, probably from the New Kingdom, more than 1,000 years after the Sphinx was supposedly carved. There's evidence of repair work and additions from that period, and attaching a beard would fit that pattern. But some think it could have been original and just fell off and was reattached multiple times over the centuries, because maintaining a giant stone beard in the desert is apparently harder than it sounds. There are also drill holes and attachment points on the chin that suggest the beard wasn't just glued on, it was engineered, bolted into place with metal or wooden supports. This was a serious beard, a load-bearing beard, and when it fell off, which it did eventually, it left scars. The idea of ancient Egyptian maintenance. Let's talk about the beard, because of course there's drama about the beard too. Between the Sphinx's paws, archaeologists found fragments of a ceremonial beard. Not a real beard, obviously, it's a statue, but a carved stone beard that was apparently attached to the chin at some point. These ceremonial beards were common in Egyptian royal iconography, symbolizing divinity and authority. Pharaohs wore them in life, gods wore them in art, and apparently the Sphinx wore one too. Some of the beard fragments are in the British Museum, because of course they are. The British Museum has a piece of everything. Other fragments are in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. Together, they suggest the beard was long and braided, projecting forward from the chin in the classic pharaonic style. The question is whether the beard was part of the original design or added later. If it was original, it supports the idea that the Sphinx was always meant to represent a pharaoh or a god, not just a lion. If it was added later, it suggests the monument was repurposed or reinterpreted at some point. Most scholars think the beard was a later addition, probably from the New Kingdom, more than 1,000 years after the Sphinx was supposedly carved. There's evidence of repair work and additions from that period, and attaching a beard would fit that pattern. But some think it could have been original and just fell off and was reattached multiple times over the centuries, because maintaining a giant stone beard in the desert is apparently harder than it sounds. There are also drill holes and attachment points on the chin that suggest the beard wasn't just glued on, it was engineered, bolted into place with metal or wooden supports. This was a serious beard, a load-bearing beard, and when it fell off, which it did eventually, it left scars. The idea of ancient Egyptian maintenance crews periodically reattaching a stone beard to a giant monument is honestly very funny to me. Just a team of workers in kilts with scaffolding and ropes hoisting a 2-ton beard back into place while someone yells directions. A little to the left. No, your other left. Okay, set it down. No, wait, it's crooked. Lift it again. Let's drift over to the missing nose, because this is the part everyone asks about. The Sphinx's nose is gone, completely gone. Not chipped, not eroded, gone. And the missing nose has spawned more myths and conspiracy theories than probably any other missing facial feature in history. People love a good mystery, and people really love blaming things on Napoleon. The most popular myth is that Napoleon's soldiers shot the nose off with a cannon during the French campaign in Egypt in 1798. This story has been repeated in tour guides, history books, and random conversations for 2 centuries. It's also completely false. We know it's false because there are drawings of the Sphinx without its nose from before Napoleon was even born. A Danish explorer named Frederick Louis Norden visited Egypt in 1737 and made detailed sketches of the Sphinx. No nose. It was already gone, so unless Napoleon had a time machine, he didn't do it. There's also a drawing from 1579 by a German artist that may or may not show the Sphinx, and may or may not show it without a nose, but the drawing is too unclear to be definitive. Still, it suggests the nose has been missing for at least 500 years, possibly much longer. So, if it wasn't Napoleon, who did it? The most commonly cited culprit is a Muslim cleric named Muhammad Sa'im al-Dar. According to the 15th century Egyptian historian al-Makrizi, Sa'im al-Dar was outraged to see local peasants making offerings to the Sphinx, treating it as an idol. In 1378, he climbed up and vandalized the face, destroying the nose and possibly other features. For this act of iconoclasm, he was executed, hanged, supposedly, for defacing a monument. This story appears in multiple historical sources, so it has more credibility than the Napoleon myth, but we still can't be absolutely certain it's true. Al-Makrizi was writing decades after the supposed event, relying on earlier accounts that may or may not have been accurate. It's plausible, it fits the timeline, but it's not confirmed. There are other theories. Maybe the nose just eroded and fell off naturally over thousands of years. Limestone is soft, and noses stick out, making them vulnerable. Look at any ancient statue. The noses are always the first thing to go. It's statistically the most fragile part. But here's the problem with that theory. The break on the Sphinx's nose is too clean. It's not gradual erosion, it's a sharp, deliberate break. There are chisel marks around the edges. Someone attacked it on purpose. This wasn't weather, this was vandalism. Some researchers think the damage was even earlier than the 14th century, possibly during the early Christian period when pagan monuments were being destroyed across the Roman Empire, or during various waves of Islamic iconoclasm. Egypt changed hands many times over the centuries, and each new regime had different feelings about giant pagan statues. There's also a theory that the nose was never finished, that the Sphinx was left incomplete for some reason, and the nose was just a rough stub that eventually wore away. But again, the evidence doesn't really support this. The rest of the face shows signs of detailed carving. It would be weird to just abandon the nose. So, the most likely explanation remains deliberate destruction, probably by Sa'im al-Dar in the 14th century, but possibly by someone else at a different time. We'll probably never know for sure. The Sphinx isn't talking, and all the witnesses are very dead. One more fun detail about the nose. There's a legend that the missing nose is in a museum somewhere, possibly the British Museum or the Louvre, catalogued as unknown fragment and sitting in storage. People love this story because it implies that the nose could theoretically be reattached someday, like some kind of archaeological jigsaw puzzle. But there's no evidence for it. No museum has ever claimed to have the Sphinx's nose. It's almost certainly dust by now, eroded into sand, blown across the desert, gone. Which is kind of peaceful when you think about it. The nose became part of the desert it was carved from. Circle of Life Simba.
Underground chambers and the Sphinx's secret spaces. So we've talked about the weathering, the missing nose, the mysterious beard, and the general chaos of trying to figure out when this thing was built. Now let's drift into even weirder territory. Let's talk about what might be underneath the Sphinx, because apparently a giant, mysterious statue sitting in the desert for thousands of years wasn't enough. There also have to be secret chambers. The idea that there are hidden rooms or tunnels beneath the Sphinx has been around for a very long time. Ancient writers mentioned it. Medieval travelers whispered about it. Modern psychics have claimed to channel information about it. And archaeologists have actually found some cavities and passages, which only makes everything more confusing, because now we have to figure out which holes are natural, which ones were carved intentionally, and which ones were dug by treasure hunters over the centuries. Let's start with what we know for sure. There are definitely some hollow spaces under and around the Sphinx. Ground-penetrating radar and seismic surveys have confirmed this. The question is what they are and why they're there. Some of the cavities are almost certainly natural. Limestone is a sedimentary rock that develops fissures, cracks, and voids over time as water seeps through it and dissolves the stone. The Giza Plateau is riddled with natural caves and cavities, so finding empty spaces under a giant piece of carved limestone isn't exactly shocking. It would be weirder if there weren't any, but some of the chambers seem too regular to be natural. There's a rectangular shaft that descends from the top of the Sphinx's back right behind the head. It's sometimes called the vertical shaft because archaeologists are very creative with names. It goes down about 25 feet and then stops. No one knows what it was for. Maybe it was a construction shaft used when building the monument. Maybe it was for drainage. Maybe it was supposed to go deeper and was never finished. Maybe it was a secret passage that got filled in. We don't know. There's also a passage that runs horizontally into the Sphinx from the rump area, which sounds undignified, but that's genuinely where it is. This tunnel goes in about 15 feet and then ends. Again, no clear purpose. Some archaeologists think these shafts were cut during restoration work in antiquity, possibly to check the structural integrity of the rock or to anchor supports. Others think they're original features with some symbolic or practical function we don't understand. And then there are the really interesting ones. In the 1990s, researchers using seismic equipment and ground-penetrating radar detected what appeared to be rectangular chambers beneath the paws of the Sphinx. Not random cavities. Rectangular, room-shaped, chamber-shaped. The kind of shapes that don't usually happen naturally. This discovery caused a lot of excitement and a lot of speculation. Were these burial chambers, storage rooms, ritual spaces? The locations fit with ancient Egyptian temple design, where underground chambers often held sacred objects or served as symbolic representations of the underworld. But without excavating, it's impossible to know what's actually down there. The Egyptian authorities have been reluctant to allow invasive exploration beneath the Sphinx. Understandably, it's one of the most famous monuments in the world. You can't just start drilling holes in it to satisfy curiosity. What if you damage the structure? What if the chambers are empty? What if they're full of groundwater and sand? The risk versus reward calculation is tricky, but the lack of excavation hasn't stopped people from theorizing. And this is where we enter the realm of alternative history and fringe archaeology, which is always a fun neighborhood to visit, even if you don't plan to buy real estate there. In the 1990s, a researcher named John Anthony West, working with Robert Schoch, the geologist we talked about earlier, promoted the idea that there were significant chambers beneath the Sphinx containing records from a lost civilization. This theory was based partly on the seismic data and partly on the writings of Edgar Cayce, a famous American psychic who died in 1945. Cayce, known as the Sleeping Prophet, claimed to receive visions while in a trance state. In several of his readings, he described a hall of records buried beneath the Sphinx, containing artifacts and knowledge from Atlantis. Yes, Atlantis. According to Cayce, this chamber would be discovered in the late 20th century and would revolutionize our understanding of human history. Obviously, mainstream archaeologists were not impressed. The idea of basing excavation plans on the dreams of a mid-century psychic seemed, to put it mildly, not scientifically rigorous. But the theory gained traction in popular culture, especially after West and Schoch's work on the water erosion hypothesis suggested the Sphinx might be much older than traditionally thought. If the Sphinx really was 10,000 years old, the thinking went, then maybe it was built by an advanced prehistoric civilization. And maybe that civilization left records, and maybe those records are in a chamber under the paws. It's a very appealing narrative. It's also completely unproven. The Egyptian Supreme Council of Antiquities, led for many years by Zahi Hawass, has consistently denied that there are any significant chambers beneath the Sphinx. Hawass has said that the cavities detected by radar are either natural or very small, and that there's no Hall of Records, no Atlantean library, no hidden treasure. He's been pretty blunt about it, calling the whole thing pseudoscience and nonsense. But Hawass also hasn't allowed full public access to the seismic data, or permitted independent verification, which hasn't helped quell the speculation. When you tell people there's definitely nothing interesting under a mysterious ancient monument and then refuse to let them look, they tend to get more suspicious, not less. There have been a few limited exploratory projects. In the 1990s, a camera was lowered into one of the shafts in the Sphinx and found a small empty chamber. No records, no artifacts, just rock. This did not stop the speculation. People just assumed that wasn't the real chamber and the actual Hall of Records is somewhere else, deeper, still waiting to be found. In 2008, ground-penetrating radar detected another anomaly beneath the left paw of the Sphinx. This one was described as a large rectangular void. The news caused a brief flurry of excitement. Surely this was it. The Hall of Records, Atlantis vindicated, Edgar Cayce proven right. But again, no excavation was permitted, and the void remains unexamined. It could be a chamber. It could be a natural cavity. It could be an ancient cistern. It could be literally anything. The whole situation is frustrating for everyone involved. Archaeologists are frustrated because they can't do their jobs properly without being accused of covering up Atlantis. Alternative researchers are frustrated because they're not being taken seriously and their requests for exploration are denied. The public is frustrated because they just want to know what's down there, if anything. Personally, I think the chances of there being a grand hall of records full of ancient wisdom beneath the Sphinx are pretty low, not zero, because history is weird and stranger things have been discovered, but low. If there are chambers, they're more likely to be mundane storage areas, drainage systems, or ritual spaces connected to the Sphinx temple, which would still be interesting and archaeologically valuable, just not Atlantis-level revelatory. But the mystery is nice. The not knowing is cozy. It's a reminder that even in our age of satellites and ground-penetrating radar, there are still secrets buried in the earth, still questions we haven't answered. Let that thought settle gently in your mind as we move on. Let's talk about the Sphinx Temple, because it's weird too, and it doesn't get nearly enough attention. Right in front of the Sphinx, carved from the same bedrock and using some of the same limestone blocks that were quarried to create the Sphinx enclosure, there's a temple. It's called the Sphinx Temple because, again, archaeologists are not hired for their creativity. The temple is mostly ruined now, just foundation stones and a few remaining walls, but it was once a substantial structure with a courtyard, columns, and an altar. The Sphinx Temple is built in a very similar style to the Valley Temple of Khafre, which sits nearby. Both temples use massive limestone blocks, some weighing over 200 tons. These blocks are fitted together with extraordinary precision, no mortar, just stone on stone, so tightly joined that you can barely slip a piece of paper between them. This has led some people to claim the blocks were cut with advanced technology, possibly lasers or sonic tools, because how else could ancient people achieve such precision? The answer, as usual, is patience, skill, and a lot of copper tools. The Egyptians were really good at working stone. They had centuries of practice. They understood the properties of limestone. They knew how to split it along natural planes, how to smooth it with abrasives, how to fit blocks together using careful measurement and trial and error. It's not a mystery. It's craftsmanship. But the Sphinx Temple is interesting for other reasons. The layout suggests it was used for solar worship. The temple is oriented east-west, aligned with the equinoxes. During the spring and fall equinoxes, the sun would have risen directly in line with the temple's axis, illuminating the interior in a very dramatic way. This kind of astronomical alignment is common in Egyptian religious architecture.
They were very into solar symbolism. The temple also has two sanctuaries, one on each side, which some researchers think represent Upper and Lower Egypt, or possibly the dual nature of the pharaoh as both a human and a god. Or maybe they just needed two rooms. We don't know. There are no inscriptions in the Sphinx temple identifying its purpose or its builder, which is becoming a theme here. Some archaeologists think the Sphinx temple was built at the same time as the Sphinx, as part of the same complex. Others think it was built later, possibly during Khafre's reign, to honor an already existing Sphinx. And a few think it predates both, built by an earlier culture and later incorporated into the Giza complex. The evidence is ambiguous enough that all three theories remain on the table. The blocks used in the Sphinx temple show different types of weathering. Some are heavily eroded, similar to the Sphinx itself, with that distinctive vertical pitting that looks like water damage. Other blocks are much less weathered, suggesting they were added or replaced later. This could mean the temple underwent multiple phases of construction and restoration over hundreds or thousands of years. Or it could mean the blocks came from different parts of the quarry and were exposed to different environmental conditions before being placed in the temple. Again, we're in the land of maybe. One detail I find oddly charming. There are graffiti marks on some of the blocks in the Sphinx temple. Not ancient graffiti, modern graffiti, or relatively modern anyway. 19th century explorers carved their names into the stones. French soldiers from Napoleon's expedition left marks. British archaeologists in the Victorian era added their initials. It's defacement, obviously, and it's unfortunate, but it's also a reminder that people have been visiting the Sphinx and leaving their mark for centuries. Everyone wants to be remembered. Everyone wants to say, "I was here." The ancient Egyptians felt the same way, which is why they carved their names on everything. The Sphinx temple just didn't get that treatment, at least not in any inscriptions that survived. Maybe there were painted dedications that wore away. Maybe the temple was considered too sacred to mark. Maybe the builders just forgot. History is full of gaps. Let's drift back to the Sphinx itself and talk about restorations, because the Sphinx has been falling apart and being patched back together for as long as we have records of it. The dream stele from Thutmose IV mentions that the Sphinx was buried in sand up to its neck in 1400 BC, which means it was already ancient and neglected by that point. Thutmose had it excavated and presumably did some restoration work, though the details are lost. This set a precedent. For the next 3,000 years, the Sphinx has been periodically dug out of the sand, repaired, and then allowed to be buried again. Sand is actually one of the best things that can happen to the Sphinx. When it's buried, it's protected from wind erosion, temperature fluctuations, and tourists. The times when the Sphinx has deteriorated most rapidly have been the times when it was fully exposed. But of course, when it's buried, no one can see it, which defeats the purpose of having a giant monument. So throughout history, rulers and archaeologists have dug it out. The monument has started to crumble, and then it gets buried again. Rinse and repeat. The Romans did restoration work on the Sphinx. We know this because there are Roman-style bricks and concrete repairs visible in the structure. The Sphinx was a tourist attraction even in Roman times. People came from across the empire to see it. They probably had the ancient equivalent of selfie sticks and overpriced tour guides. In the early 20th century, French and then Egyptian archaeologists conducted major excavations and restorations. They cleared the sand, repaired cracks, and added new stone blocks to replace sections that had completely eroded away. This stabilized the structure, but also created a conservation dilemma. How much restoration is too much? At what point does repairing something change it so much that it's no longer the original? Some of the restoration work in the 1980s and 90s was later criticized as being too aggressive. New limestone blocks were added to the Sphinx's haunches and shoulders, replacing stone that had worn away. The new blocks are visibly different from the original weathered limestone, which bothers purists who think monuments should be left as they are, even if that means they'll eventually collapse. But if you don't restore it, the Sphinx will continue to erode. The limestone is soft. The environment is harsh. Every year, wind and sand and temperature changes wear away a little more stone. In a few centuries, without intervention, the Sphinx could be unrecognizable. In a few millennia, it might be gone entirely. So conservators are in the impossible position of trying to preserve a monument that is, by its nature, temporary. There's also the problem of the water table. The Giza Plateau sits on a layer of clay and shale that holds water. As Cairo has grown, the water table has risen due to irrigation, sewage, and general urban water use. Rising groundwater brings salts up into the limestone, and when the water evaporates, the salts crystallize and cause the stone to crack and flake from the inside. It's called salt weathering, and it's one of the biggest threats to the Sphinx today. Engineers have installed drainage systems and pumps to lower the water table around the Sphinx, but it's an ongoing battle. Every year, more cracks appear, more stone flakes off, more repairs are needed. The Sphinx is slowly, gently falling apart, and there's only so much that can be done to stop it. In a way, this is appropriate. The Sphinx has always been about time and erosion and the slow, inevitable decay of everything. It was ancient when Herodotus visited Egypt in the 5th century BC, and he didn't even mention it, which suggests it was already buried or considered unremarkable. It was mysterious when Arab historians wrote about it in the Middle Ages, calling it the Father of Terror because of its imposing presence. It was romantic when European explorers sketched it in the 18th and 19th centuries, imagining lost civilizations and ancient wisdom. And now it's a conservation challenge, a tourist attraction, and a symbol of humanity's endless fascination with the past. There's something peaceful about that. The Sphinx has outlasted empires, religions, languages, entire ways of life. It's watched the Nile flood and recede thousands of times. It's seen conquerors come and go, and it's still there, battered and eroded and patched together, but still there, still staring at the sunrise, still keeping its secrets. Tunnels, tombs, and the Sphinx's neighbors. Now let's talk about the area around the Sphinx, because it turns out the giant lion statue isn't sitting alone in the desert. It's part of a much larger complex of structures, tunnels, and tombs, most of which are just as mysterious and poorly understood as the Sphinx itself. First, there's the Sphinx enclosure. The Sphinx isn't sitting on top of the plateau. It's sitting in a pit carved out of the bedrock. When the ancient builders created the Sphinx, they essentially quarried down into the limestone, cutting away the stone around the body to create walls on 3 sides. These walls are about 20 feet high in some places, and they show the same weathering patterns as the Sphinx itself. Those deep vertical erosion channels that sparked the whole water damage debate. The enclosure walls are significant because they're made of the same bedrock as the Sphinx, carved at the same time. If you can date the weathering on the walls, you can theoretically date the Sphinx. But of course, nothing is that simple. The walls have been repaired and recut multiple times over the millennia. There are layers of different stone, different weathering patterns, different tool marks. It's like trying to date a house that's been renovated 12 times. To the south of the Sphinx, there's a causeway that runs up to Khafre's pyramid. This causeway was a ceremonial pathway used for funeral processions when the pyramid was built. The causeway connects Khafre's valley temple to his pyramid temple, and it runs right past the Sphinx. Some archaeologists think this proves Khafre built the Sphinx, because why would you run your fancy funeral pathway past someone else's monument? Others say the causeway could have been built to incorporate an already existing sphinx, because the Egyptians were big on connecting new structures to old sacred sites. There are also a series of tombs cut into the rock around the Sphinx enclosure. These are called the tombs of the builders, or sometimes the workers' cemetery, and they contain the burials of people who probably worked on the Giza pyramids. The tombs are much simpler than the elaborate royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. These are working-class burials, but they're still carefully arranged, with offering chambers and false doors and all the standard Egyptian funerary features. What's interesting is that some of these tombs are cut into the same bedrock as the Sphinx, and some are clearly later additions. You can see where tomb entrances were carved right through existing erosion patterns on the enclosure walls. This suggests the Sphinx enclosure was already old and weathered when the tombs were cut. But again, we don't know how old. Could be a few decades, could be a few centuries, could be millennia. The rock isn't talking. In the 1990s, archaeologists discovered a network of tunnels beneath the Sphinx enclosure. These tunnels are natural limestone caves that were modified and expanded by human hands. Some of them connect to the tombs. Some of them seem to go nowhere. Some of them are partially collapsed and can't be explored safely. One tunnel in particular caused a lot of excitement. It runs from the Sphinx enclosure toward the Valley Temple of Khafre, and it's lined with cut stone blocks, suggesting it was deliberately constructed. Not just a natural cave. Where does it go? What was it for? No idea. The tunnel is partially flooded now due to the rising water table, and exploring it would require pumping out water and shoring up unstable sections, which is expensive and risky. There are theories, of course. Maybe the tunnel was used for ritual purposes, allowing priests to move between the Sphinx and the temple without being seen. Maybe it was a drainage channel to prevent flooding in the enclosure. Maybe it was a storage area. Maybe it connected to other tunnels that haven't been found yet. The only way to know for sure would be to excavate it fully, and that hasn't happened. The whole area around the Sphinx is riddled with these kinds of features. Holes in the ground, unexplained cuts in the rock, walls that don't connect to anything, limestone blocks that don't match the surrounding stone. It's like a three-dimensional puzzle where half the pieces are missing and the other half might not even belong to the same puzzle. Some researchers think the Sphinx was part of a much larger temple complex that extended across the plateau, with multiple buildings, courtyards, and sacred pools. Most of this complex would have been built with mud brick and wood, materials that don't survive thousands of years in the archaeological record. So all we have left are the stone foundations and the mysterious holes where posts and walls once stood. Others think the Sphinx was always a standalone monument, maybe with just the Sphinx temple in front of it, and all the other features around it are from later periods when the area was repurposed and rebuilt. The problem is that without datable artifacts or inscriptions, it's almost impossible to create a definitive timeline. Let's float over to the inventory stele, because this is another piece of evidence that makes everything more confusing. The inventory stele is a stone tablet that was found near the Great Pyramid in the 19th century. It's now in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. The stele is dated to the 26th dynasty, around 670 BC, which makes it relatively late in Egyptian history. But the inscription on it tells a story about Khufu, the pharaoh who built the Great Pyramid more than 2,000 years earlier. According to the stele, Khufu built a temple near the House of the Sphinx, which implies the Sphinx already existed during Khufu's reign. If that's true, it would mean the Sphinx predates Khafre, Khufu's son, and was built by Khufu himself, or by someone even earlier. This would overturn the traditional chronology that assigns the Sphinx to Khafre. Mainstream Egyptologists dismiss the inventory stele as a later fabrication. The 26th dynasty was a period of Egyptian revival when rulers tried to reconnect with the glorious Old Kingdom past. They built temples in archaic styles and wrote inscriptions attributing old monuments to famous pharaohs, sometimes making things up to sound more impressive. It was essentially historical fan fiction. The language and style of the inventory stele are consistent with the 26th dynasty, not the Old Kingdom. So most scholars think the stele is a later invention, not a reliable historical document. But some researchers take it seriously, arguing that the scribes who wrote it might have had access to older records that are now lost. Maybe there really was a tradition that the Sphinx existed before Khafre. Maybe the stele preserves a genuine memory, even if the physical artifact is later. It's another maybe. Another frustrating gap in the evidence. Another reason why pinning down the Sphinx's true age and builder is so difficult. There's also the issue of the Sphinx's paws. Between the two front paws, there's a small open-air chapel. This is where the dream stele stands, along with fragments of other stele and offerings left by ancient visitors. The chapel area has been excavated multiple times, and archaeologists have found everything from pottery shards to pieces of statues to random stones with no clear purpose. Some of the pottery found between the paws dates to the Old Kingdom, which supports the idea that the Sphinx was already an important site in Khufu or Khafre's time, but pottery can move around. It can be brought from elsewhere. It can be deposited centuries after it was made. So finding Old Kingdom pottery near the Sphinx doesn't definitively prove when the Sphinx was carved. It just proves people were visiting the area during the Old Kingdom, which we already knew because the pyramids are right there. There are also offering tables and altars carved into the bedrock near the Sphinx's paws.
These are simple, rectangular depressions where people would leave food, drink, or incense for the gods. Some of these offering tables have inscriptions, but they're from later periods, mostly the New Kingdom and later. Again, this tells us the Sphinx was being actively worshipped and maintained during those periods, but it doesn't tell us when it was originally built. What's particularly interesting is that the Sphinx seems to have been identified with different gods at different times. During the New Kingdom, it was associated with Horamakhet, Horus of the horizon, a sun god. Later, during the Greek and Roman periods, it was identified with the Greek god Harmakis, a syncretic deity combining Egyptian and Greek elements. And in some texts, it's associated with Ra, the chief sun god, or even with the pharaoh himself as a divine being. This shifting identity suggests the Sphinx's original meaning and purpose were already forgotten by the New Kingdom. If people in 1400 BC weren't sure what the Sphinx represented or who built it, we're certainly not going to figure it out now. The monument had already become a mystery to the ancient Egyptians themselves. Let's talk about sound and acoustics, because there's a weird footnote in Sphinx research that suggests the monument might have had acoustic properties. In the 1990s, some researchers noticed that the Sphinx enclosure has unusual resonance. If you stand in certain spots and make sounds, the enclosure amplifies them in strange ways. Deep frequencies seem to bounce around the limestone walls, creating an almost reverberating effect. This led to speculation that the Sphinx was designed as some kind of acoustic chamber, possibly for rituals involving chanting or music. The theory goes that ancient priests could have used the enclosure as a natural amplifier, making their voices sound louder and more impressive during ceremonies. Imagine standing between the Sphinx's paws while a priest chants in the enclosed space, their voice echoing off the stone walls, creating an otherworldly atmosphere. It would have been pretty effective theater. But here's the thing. Any enclosed stone space will have acoustic properties. Caves resonate, canyons echo. It doesn't mean they were designed for that purpose. The acoustic effects in the Sphinx enclosure could be entirely accidental, a side effect of the geometry and materials, not an intentional feature. Still, the Egyptians were aware of acoustics. They built temples with specific sound properties. The hypostyle hall at Karnak, for example, has columns arranged in a way that creates interesting echoes and resonances. So it's not impossible that the Sphinx enclosure was designed with sound in mind. It's just unproven. There have been a few experiments trying to measure the Sphinx's acoustic properties more scientifically, using frequency analyzers and recording equipment. The results are interesting, but inconclusive. Yes, the enclosure resonates at certain frequencies. Yes, this could have been used ritually, but we have no evidence that it actually was. It's another intriguing possibility floating in the sea of unknowns. Now let's drift into one of my favorite weird details about the Sphinx, the lion's tail. If you walk around to the back of the Sphinx, which tourists usually don't do because it's less photogenic and there are barriers, you can see that the Sphinx has a tail. Obviously, it's a lion body, so of course it has a tail, but the tail is carved in a very specific way. It's curled around the right haunch, lying flat against the body, carved in relief against the limestone. What's odd is that the tail shows different weathering from the rest of the body. It's more protected, tucked against the haunch, so it hasn't eroded as much. You can still see details in the tail carving that are completely worn away on other parts of the Sphinx. This has led some researchers to study the tail closely, trying to determine carving techniques and original surface details. The tail also has traces of paint. Red and yellow pigments are visible in the crevices, protected from the elements by the tail's position. This confirms that the whole Sphinx was once painted, not just the face. Imagine it, a giant lion body in yellow ochre, a human face in red, the Nema's headdress striped in blue and gold. It would have been garish and magnificent, visible from miles away across the desert. But over time, the paint wore off, the colors faded, and we were left with the monochrome limestone version. It's like looking at a sun-bleached photograph of something that was once vibrant and loud. The tail also has some strange marks on it. There are what appear to be hieroglyphic inscriptions, very faint, almost invisible unless the light hits them just right. No one has been able to definitively read these marks. They might be ancient graffiti. They might be mason's marks from the original carvers. They might just be natural patterns in the stone that happen to look like symbols. Again, we don't know. There's also a persistent legend that the Sphinx's tail contains a hidden entrance to a chamber beneath the monument. This legend has been around since at least medieval times. Arab writers mentioned it, Renaissance travelers repeated it, modern treasure hunters have looked for it, but no one has ever found a door in the tail. If it exists, it's very well hidden. More likely, it's just another myth that grew up around the monument. But people keep looking, because the idea of a secret entrance is too appealing to let go. Maybe there's a hidden switch. Maybe you have to press the right stone. Maybe the tail lifts up like a hatch. It's fun to imagine, even if it's probably nonsense. Let's talk about Napoleon again, briefly, because even though he didn't shoot off the nose, he did have an interesting interaction with the Sphinx.
When Napoleon invaded Egypt in 1798, he brought with him not just soldiers, but also scientists, artists, and scholars. This group, called the savants, was tasked with studying and documenting everything they found in Egypt. They measured pyramids, copied inscriptions, sketched temples, and collected artifacts. Their work eventually resulted in the massive multi-volume Description de l'Égypte, one of the most important early works of Egyptology. The savants also studied the Sphinx, of course. They measured it, drew it from multiple angles, and noted its condition. At the time, the Sphinx was buried in sand up to its neck, as it had been for centuries. Only the head was visible, sticking out of a sand dune like some kind of surreal sculpture. According to some accounts, Napoleon camped near the Sphinx and spent a night alone inside the Great Pyramid, emerging the next morning pale and shaken, refusing to talk about what he'd experienced. This story is almost certainly apocryphal, a romantic invention by later writers. But it's become part of Napoleon's legend, the idea that he had some kind of mystical experience among the ancient monuments. Whether Napoleon actually spent time near the Sphinx contemplating mortality and empire is unclear. What is clear is that his expedition sparked European fascination with Egypt. Before Napoleon, Egypt was a distant, exotic place that most Europeans knew only from Bible stories and classical texts. After Napoleon, Egypt became a subject of intense study, tourism, and, unfortunately, looting. The early 19th century saw a flood of European adventurers descending on Egypt, hauling away obelisks, statues, mummies, and anything else they could fit on a ship. Museums in London, Paris, Berlin, and Turin filled with Egyptian artifacts, many acquired through questionable means. The Sphinx was too big to steal, thankfully, but it was sketched, painted, photographed, and mythologized endlessly. Victorian travelers loved the Sphinx. It appeared in countless paintings, usually depicted in romantic, melancholic poses, often with Arabs or camels in the foreground for exotic flavor. The Sphinx became a symbol of ancient mystery and lost wisdom,
a monument to the passage of time and the futility of human ambition. Very 19th century sensibility. Mark Twain visited the Sphinx in 1867 and described it in his travel book, The Innocents Abroad. He was, characteristically, unimpressed. He called the Sphinx the most memorable thing in Egypt, but also noted that it looked sad and dignified and was more pathetic than impressive. Twain had a gift for deflating romantic expectations. Other visitors were more reverential. Gustave Flaubert, the French novelist, visited in 1850 and wrote about feeling overwhelmed by the Sphinx's presence, describing it as the embodiment of death and eternity. Flaubert being Flaubert, he also complained about the heat and the flies, because even ancient mysteries can't compete with basic discomfort. By the late 19th century, the Sphinx had become a must-see stop on the grand tour of the Middle East. Wealthy tourists would hire guides, ride camels out to Giza, have their photographs taken in front of the Sphinx, and then return to their hotels to write letters home about the profound spiritual experience they'd had. Tourism has always been performative. The early photographs of the Sphinx are fascinating. They show the monument in various states of excavation, sometimes completely buried except for the head, sometimes half dug out with workers visible in the frame, shoveling sand. These images capture a transitional moment in the Sphinx's history, when it was being transformed from a mysterious, half-buried relic into a fully exposed tourist attraction. Let's drift into the 20th century and talk about modern conservation efforts, because this is where things get technical and slow, which is perfect for our purposes. In the 1920s and 30s, Egyptian and French archaeologists conducted major excavations around the Sphinx, clearing away sand and debris, exposing the full body for the first time in centuries. This was exciting from an archaeological perspective, but it also meant the Sphinx was now fully exposed to the elements, which accelerated deterioration. By the 1980s, chunks of limestone were literally falling off the Sphinx. The neck area was particularly unstable, with large cracks threatening to separate the head from the body. Engineers were brought in to assess the structural integrity, and the news wasn't good. The Sphinx was in danger of collapse. A major restoration project was launched in 1989. Workers replaced damaged stones, filled cracks with mortar, and installed support structures to stabilize weak areas. The restoration took years and cost millions of dollars. It also sparked controversy because some of the techniques used were later deemed inappropriate for ancient monuments. For example, workers used modern cement mortar to fill cracks, which turned out to be a mistake. Cement is harder than limestone, so when the monument expands and contracts with temperature changes, the cement doesn't flex the way the original stone does. This creates pressure points that can cause new cracks. Oops. In the 1990s, another round of restoration was needed to fix the problems created by the first restoration. This time, conservators used materials that more closely matched the original limestone, and they focused on stabilization rather than replacement. It was a learning curve. We're still learning. Current conservation philosophy is to do as little as possible. Stabilize what's actively deteriorating, prevent further damage, but don't try to make the monument look new. Accept the weathering as part of the monument's history. Let it age gracefully. This is harder than it sounds, because tourists want to see an impressive monument, not a crumbling ruin. There's pressure to make the Sphinx look good for photographs, which means pressure to repair and rebuild. But every intervention changes the monument a little bit. Every new stone added is a piece of the original lost. It's a philosophical question as much as a practical one. What are we preserving? The physical stones? The visual appearance? The historical authenticity? The tourist experience? All of the above? These priorities sometimes conflict. The Egyptian government has installed barriers around the Sphinx to keep tourists at a distance, which helps reduce physical wear from people touching the monument. They've also limited the number of visitors allowed in certain areas at certain times, but the Sphinx still receives thousands of visitors every day, and all those footsteps, all that breath, All that human presence has an impact. There's also the problem of pollution. Cairo is a huge, polluted city, and the air quality is terrible. Industrial emissions, car exhaust, and dust all settle on the Sphinx, creating a grimy coating that traps moisture and accelerates chemical weathering. Cleaning the monument removes the grime, but also removes a tiny layer of stone each time. You can't win. Climate change is another factor. Temperature extremes are becoming more common. Rainfall patterns are changing. Even in the desert, these shifts affect the monument. Limestone expands when it heats up and contracts when it cools down. Repeated cycles of expansion and contraction create stress fractures. Over decades and centuries, this adds up. So the Sphinx is fighting a slow war against time, weather, pollution, and entropy. And it's losing, as everything does. But it's losing slowly, which is something.
Riddles, legends, and the Sphinx in popular imagination. Now let's talk about the riddle, because when most people think of sphinxes, they think of riddles. Except the Great Sphinx of Giza probably never asked anyone a riddle in its entire existence. That's a different sphinx from a completely different culture, and the fact that these two things get conflated tells us a lot about how mythology gets jumbled in the popular imagination. The riddle-asking sphinx comes from Greek mythology, specifically the story of Oedipus. In that tale, a sphinx with the body of a lion, wings of an eagle, and the head of a woman terrorized the city of Thebes, asking travelers a riddle. What walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs at noon, and 3 legs in the evening? Anyone who answered incorrectly was killed and eaten. Oedipus correctly answered, man who crawls as a baby, walks upright as an adult, and uses a cane in old age. The Sphinx, defeated by his cleverness, threw herself off a cliff. It's a great story, very dramatic, but it has absolutely nothing to do with the Egyptian Sphinx. The Greeks saw the Sphinx during their visits to Egypt and apparently thought, hey, we have sphinxes in our mythology too, and just assumed they were the same thing. They weren't. Egyptian sphinxes were royal symbols, representations of pharaonic power combining human intelligence with leonine strength. They didn't ask riddles, they didn't eat people, they just sat there looking regal. But the Greek version was more exciting, so it's the one that stuck in Western imagination. By the Renaissance, when European scholars started writing about Egypt, they merged the two traditions. The Sphinx of Giza became the Sphinx, and it inherited all the Greek baggage about riddles and mysteries, even though none of that was originally Egyptian.
This confusion persists today. People visit the Sphinx expecting some kind of profound mystery to solve, some riddle embedded in its construction or orientation. And there are mysteries, as we've discussed, but they're not the deliberate puzzle box kind. They're just the normal mysteries that accumulate around very old things when records are lost and contexts are forgotten. Still, the idea that the Sphinx guards ancient secrets has proven irresistible. Medieval Arab scholars wrote that the Sphinx's eyes were made of precious stones and that treasure was hidden inside the monument. European occultists in the 19th century claimed the Sphinx was built by ancient magicians and contained mystical knowledge accessible only to initiates. Modern New Age writers suggest the Sphinx is a marker for ley lines or a beacon for extraterrestrial visitors. None of this is true, but it's all very appealing. The Sphinx has become a blank screen onto which people project their desires for mystery and meaning. It's a monument that seems like it should mean something profound, so we keep inventing profundities to assign to it. There's also the astronomical angle, which we touched on earlier, but deserves more attention because it's become hugely popular in alternative history circles. The basic idea is this. The Sphinx faces due east, staring at the sunrise. During the spring equinox, the sun rises directly in front of the Sphinx. Around 10,500 BC, the constellation Leo would have been rising just before the sun during the spring equinox, a phenomenon called heliacal rising. Since the Sphinx has a lion's body, some researchers think this is not a coincidence. The Sphinx, they argue, was built to mark the age of Leo, an astrological era that lasted from roughly 10,970 BC to 8,810 BC. This theory was popularized by Robert Bauval and Graham Hancock in the 1990s. They suggested that the entire Giza complex is a map of the heavens, with the three pyramids corresponding to the three stars in Orion's belt and the Sphinx representing Leo. The whole plateau, according to this theory, is a massive astronomical monument built by an advanced prehistoric civilization to encode knowledge about precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that causes the constellations to shift position over thousands of years. Mainstream archaeologists have been very skeptical of this. The correlation between the pyramids and Orion's belt is approximate at best, and you can find patterns in random arrangements of objects if you look hard enough. The Leo connection is more suggestive, but it requires accepting that the Sphinx was built around 10,500 BC, which conflicts with all the archaeological evidence. Also, there's no evidence that the ancient Egyptians recognized the constellation Leo. They had their own system of constellations different from the Greek zodiac. The lion was an important symbol in Egyptian religion, yes, but it wasn't specifically associated with that particular arrangement of stars. The whole theory requires reading Greek and modern astrological concepts back onto a culture that didn't use them. But the theory persists because it's elegant. It tells a story about ancient wisdom and lost civilizations. It suggests that the people who built the Sphinx were sophisticated astronomers with knowledge that wouldn't be rediscovered for millennia. It makes the past more impressive, more mysterious, more worth caring about. And honestly, I understand the appeal. The idea that there was once a great civilization, now lost, that understood things we're only beginning to grasp is deeply romantic. It's the same impulse that drives stories about Atlantis or Mu or any number of legendary lost lands. We want to believe that the past was more glorious than it probably was. The reality is probably more mundane. The Sphinx faces east because that's where the sun rises, and the sun was important in Egyptian religion. It has a lion's body because lions were royal symbols. It was built during the Old Kingdom, probably by Khafre as part of his funerary complex. There's no hidden astronomical code. There's no lost civilization. It's just a very old statue that's been misunderstood and mythologized for thousands of years. But I could be wrong. That's the thing about archaeology. New discoveries can overturn old certainties. Maybe tomorrow someone will excavate a chamber beneath the Sphinx containing inscriptions that definitively date it to 10,000 BC. Maybe there really is a hall of records waiting to be found. Probably not, but maybe. Let's talk about the Sphinx in art and literature, because the monument has inspired countless creative works over the centuries. In ancient Roman poetry, the Sphinx appears as a symbol of Egypt's mysterious otherness. Roman poets visiting Egypt wrote about the Sphinx as an enigmatic guardian, silent and inscrutable, embodying the ancient wisdom of a civilization they didn't fully understand. This set a template that would persist for 2,000 years. Medieval European writers who knew about the Sphinx only from classical texts imagined it as a monster, something demonic or pagan. It appeared in illuminated manuscripts as a grotesque creature, often combined with other hybrid beasts like griffins and chimeras. The Sphinx became part of the medieval bestiary, a category of unnatural, vaguely threatening things from distant lands. When European travelers actually reached Egypt and saw the Sphinx firsthand, they were often disappointed. It didn't look like a monster, it looked like a damaged statue. But they wrote about it anyway because their readers back home expected exotic tales. So the travel accounts of the 17th and 18th centuries are full of embellished descriptions, making the Sphinx more impressive and mysterious than it actually appeared. Napoleon's expedition changed this. The scientific documentation produced by the savants gave Europeans accurate measurements and drawings for the first time. The Sphinx could now be studied rather than just fantasized about. But that didn't stop artists from taking liberties. Romantic painters in the 19th century loved the Sphinx. They painted it in dramatic lighting, usually at sunset or under moonlight, often with storms gathering in the background. These paintings weren't about accuracy, they were about mood. The Sphinx became a symbol of melancholy, of empires fallen, of the inevitable decay of all human achievement. Very on brand for Romanticism. Writers picked up the same themes. Percy Bysshe Shelley's poem Ozymandias, written in 1818, isn't about the Sphinx specifically, but it captures the same feeling. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. nothing beside remains. The Sphinx could have been the model for Shelley's shattered statue, a monument to vanished power slowly being consumed by the desert. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Sphinx appeared frequently in occult and mystical literature. Aleister Crowley claimed to have performed magical rituals near the Sphinx. Madame Blavatsky, founder of Theosophy, wrote that the Sphinx contained secret knowledge from Atlantis. These claims were nonsense, but they influenced how a generation of seekers and mystics thought about Egypt. The Sphinx also became a popular motif in Freemasonry and other fraternal organizations. Egyptian symbolism in general was fashionable in these groups, representing ancient wisdom and hidden knowledge. Lodges were decorated with Sphinx statues, pyramids, and hieroglyphics, most of which had nothing to do with actual Egyptian religion, but looked impressive. In popular fiction, the Sphinx appeared as a location for adventure stories. Edgar Rice Burroughs, creator of Tarzan, wrote several novels set in Egypt featuring lost cities and ancient mysteries near the Sphinx. Agatha Christie set parts of her novel Death on the Nile near Giza, using the monuments as atmospheric backdrop. The Sphinx became shorthand for exotic danger and archaeological intrigue. Hollywood picked up the theme. The 1954 film Land of the Pharaohs featured elaborate reconstructions of ancient Egypt, including a Sphinx that looked nothing like the real one, but was more visually dramatic. The 1999 film The Mummy used Giza as a location, though most of the Sphinx scenes were shot on sets or with CGI. Accuracy was less important than spectacle. In modern times, the Sphinx has appeared in video games, comic books, cartoons, and pretty much every medium you can think of. It's usually depicted as a guardian or a puzzle to solve, drawing on the Greek riddle tradition rather than the Egyptian reality. The Sphinx has become a pop culture icon, divorced from its historical context, just a generic symbol of ancient mystery. There is something both sad and inevitable about this. When a monument becomes too famous, it stops being itself and becomes a symbol. The real Sphinx, with all its uncertainties and mundane details, gets lost beneath layers of myth and marketing. But that's the price of fame, I suppose. Let's drift back to Egypt and talk about how the Sphinx has been viewed by Egyptians themselves over the centuries, because the Western obsession with the monument sometimes obscures the fact that it's located in Egypt and has been part of Egyptian culture for thousands of years. In ancient times, the Sphinx was called Shesep-Ankh, which might mean living image, though the translation is uncertain. In the New Kingdom, it was associated with the god Hormeket, as we discussed earlier. It was a site of pilgrimage and worship. People left offerings, carved stelae, built small shrines around it. The Sphinx was an active part of religious life, not just a monument to look at. After Egypt became Christian in the early centuries AD, attitudes towards pharaonic monuments changed. Ancient temples and statues were seen as pagan idols, remnants of a false religion. Some were destroyed, others were repurposed as churches or quarries. The Sphinx, being enormous and made of bedrock, couldn't easily be demolished, so it was mostly ignored. It became a relic of the pre-Christian past, left to slowly disappear under the sand. In Egypt became Islamic in the 7th century, attitudes shifted again. Some Muslim scholars admired the technical achievements of the ancient Egyptians, seeing the pyramids and the Sphinx as evidence of human ingenuity. Others viewed them with suspicion as monuments built by pharaohs who had opposed God's prophets. There was no single Islamic view of the Sphinx. It depended on the individual scholar. The story of Siam al-Dar destroying the Sphinx's nose in the 14th century, if true, represents an iconoclastic impulse, a desire to remove pagan imagery from the landscape. But this wasn't official policy, it was the act of one zealous individual. Most Islamic authorities left the Sphinx alone. It wasn't worth the effort to destroy, and it wasn't causing any harm just sitting there. By the Ottoman period, the Sphinx was simply part of the landscape, a curiosity from the distant past. Local people told stories about it, legends about treasures and curses and hidden chambers. European travelers recorded these stories, though how much was genuine folk belief and how much was performance for gullible foreigners is hard to say. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, as Egyptology developed as a field, Egyptians themselves became increasingly interested in their pharaonic heritage. Egyptian scholars like Ahmed Kamal and Salim Hassan made important contributions to the study of Giza and the Sphinx. But much of the early work was dominated by European archaeologists, who often treated Egypt as an open-air museum for Western scholarship. This created tension. Egyptian monuments were being studied and interpreted by foreigners, who then displayed their findings in European museums. The Sphinx couldn't be moved, but countless smaller artifacts from the Giza Plateau ended up in London, Paris, and Berlin. Egyptian nationalism in the early 20th century increasingly emphasized pharaonic heritage as a source of pride and identity, distinct from both Arab and Islamic traditions. After Egypt gained independence in 1922, control of archaeological sites gradually shifted to Egyptian authorities. By the mid-20th century, the Egyptian Antiquities Service, later the Supreme Council of Antiquities, had taken over management of Giza. Egyptian archaeologists and conservators became the primary caretakers of the Sphinx. This shift wasn't without friction. Western archaeologists sometimes chafed at restrictions on excavation and research. Egyptian authorities were protective of their heritage and suspicious of foreign scholars trying to promote alternative theories that conflicted with established chronologies. The debates about the Sphinx's age and the water erosion hypothesis, for example, became somewhat politicized, with national pride and academic authority getting tangled together. In recent decades, the Sphinx has become an important symbol of Egyptian identity and tourism. It appears on currency, stamps, and government logos. It's one of the most photographed monuments in the world. The Egyptian government has invested heavily in preserving and presenting the Sphinx to visitors because it's a major economic asset. But there's also a sense of ownership and responsibility. The Sphinx isn't just a tourist attraction. It's part of Egypt's heritage, a link to a past that Egyptians can claim as their own. When foreign researchers propose controversial theories about the Sphinx, Egyptian scholars often push back, not necessarily because the theories are wrong, but because they seem to diminish Egyptian achievement or suggest that Egyptians don't understand their own history. This dynamic is complicated and worth thinking about. Who owns the past? Who has the right to interpret it? These aren't simple questions, and they don't have simple answers. Let's talk about some of the other sphinxes, because the Great Sphinx isn't alone. Egypt is full of sphinx statues, though none is large or famous.
The most common type is the cryosphinx, which has a ram's head instead of a human head. These were associated with the god Amun and lined the processional ways at Karnak and Luxor. Hundreds of ram-headed sphinxes, rows of them, creating a ceremonial pathway between temples. They're smaller than the Great Sphinx, usually just a few feet tall, but collectively they're impressive. There are also hierosphinxes with falcon heads, representing Horus, and androsphinxes with human heads, like the Great Sphinx. These appear in various sizes, from tiny amulets to monumental statues. The Sphinx as a form was versatile, adaptable to different gods and different contexts. But none of them have the presence of the Great Sphinx. Size matters. A statue you can walk past is interesting. A statue you can walk inside is awe-inspiring. The Great Sphinx isn't just big, it's overwhelming. It dwarfs human scale. Standing next to it, you feel small, temporary, insignificant, which is probably the point. The other sphinxes also don't have the mystery. We know who made them, when they were made, what they represented. They have inscriptions. They fit into established chronologies. They're interesting archaeologically, but they don't spark the same wild speculation. The Great Sphinx's lack of inscriptions, its ambiguous dating, its erosion and damage, all these things that make it frustrating to study also make it endlessly fascinating. It's a puzzle without a clear solution, and humans love puzzles. There are Sphinx statues outside Egypt too, though they're usually later and derivative. The Greeks and Romans copied the Sphinx motif, using it decoratively in architecture and sculpture. Renaissance artists revived it during the neoclassical period. Sphinxes appear in gardens, on buildings, in fountains, all over Europe and eventually America. But these are just decorations, symbols borrowed from Egypt without the cultural context. They're sphinxes in form, but not in meaning. The Great Sphinx remains unique, a monument rooted in its specific time and place, even if we don't fully understand what that time and place were. Let's drift into one more alternative theory before we start winding down, because I want to talk about the water shafts hypothesis. In the 1990s, a researcher named John Anthony West, working with a team that included Robert Schoch, conducted seismic surveys around the Sphinx. They detected what appeared to be vertical shafts beneath the monument, regularly spaced, descending into the bedrock. These shafts were interpreted as possible water channels or wells. West proposed that these shafts were part of a sophisticated hydraulic system, possibly used to create an underground pool or to channel water for ritual purposes. He suggested this was evidence of advanced engineering knowledge, supporting the idea that the Sphinx was built by a more sophisticated culture than we give credit for. Mainstream archaeologists pointed out that water management was a well-known Egyptian skill. They built canals, irrigation systems, and nilometers to measure flood levels. Creating wells or drainage shafts wouldn't require lost ancient technology. It would just require competent engineering, which the Egyptians demonstrably had. Also, the seismic data was ambiguous. Vertical anomalies in limestone can be caused by many things: natural fissures, tree roots from vegetation that grew thousands of years ago when the climate was different, or simply variations in rock density. Without excavating, you can't know what the anomalies represent. West's theory didn't gain traction in academic circles, but it added another layer to the Sphinx's mythology. The idea of hidden water channels, secret wells, underground pools, all of it feeds into the sense that there's more to the Sphinx than meets the eye. And maybe there is. Maybe there are features we haven't discovered yet. The Sphinx has surprised us before. It could surprise us again. But until someone actually excavates and finds something definitive, we're just speculating. Which brings us to a broader point about the Sphinx and about history in general. We want certainty. We want clear answers. We want to know who built it, when, why, and how. But history doesn't always give us that. Sometimes the past is genuinely lost. Sometimes the evidence is too degraded to read. Sometimes we just have to live with not knowing. And that's okay. There's a certain peace in accepting uncertainty. The Sphinx has been standing there for thousands of years without telling us its secrets, and it will probably continue standing there for thousands more, still keeping those secrets. We can study it, measure it, theorize about it, but ultimately it remains itself, independent of our interpretations. Let that thought settle in your mind as we move toward the end of this journey.
Modern mysteries and the Sphinx's future. Let's talk about what's happening with the Sphinx right now, in the present day, because the monument's story didn't end in ancient times. It's still evolving, still being studied, still presenting new questions. Current conservation efforts focus on monitoring and minimal intervention. Engineers have installed sensors throughout the Sphinx to track movement, temperature changes, and moisture levels. These sensors provide real-time data about the monument's condition, allowing conservators to detect problems before they become critical. One of the biggest concerns is the limestone itself. The Sphinx is made of different layers of limestone, deposited millions of years ago when the area was underwater. These layers have different densities and weather at different rates. Some layers are hard and durable, others are soft and crumbly. This creates weak points where the stone is more likely to crack or flake. The soft layers are concentrated in the lower parts of the Sphinx's body, which is why the haunches and paws show more damage than the head. The head is carved from a harder layer of limestone, which is part of why it has survived in better condition. But this also creates stress points where hard stone meets soft stone, and those junctions are vulnerable to fracturing. Climate change is making everything more unpredictable. Temperature swings are becoming more extreme. When temperatures fluctuate rapidly, the limestone expands and contracts, creating stress. Over time, this mechanical weathering adds up. The Sphinx has survived 5,000 years of normal weather patterns. Whether it can survive the next century of abnormal patterns is an open question. There's also the issue of mass tourism. Before the COVID-19 pandemic, Giza received millions of visitors per year. During the pandemic, tourism stopped almost completely for several months. Conservators noticed that the monuments actually improved during this period. Without constant foot traffic, vibrations from buses, and breath and sweat from crowds of people, the deterioration slowed. This created a dilemma. Tourism is essential for Egypt's economy. The revenue from ticket sales funds conservation work and supports local communities. But tourism also damages the monuments it celebrates. How do you balance preservation with access? How do you let people experience these sites without loving them to death? The Egyptian government has tried various approaches. They've built viewing platforms that keep tourists at a distance. They've limited the number of people allowed near the Sphinx at any given time. They've raised ticket prices to reduce crowds. They've created replica sites where people can experience the monuments virtually without physically visiting them. None of these solutions is perfect. Wealthy tourists complain about restrictions and higher prices. Local guides and vendors lose income when visitor numbers drop. Conservationists argue that any access causes damage and the sites should be closed entirely. It's a complex problem with no easy answer. There's also ongoing debate about restoration. Some conservators believe damaged sections of the Sphinx should be rebuilt to preserve the monument's overall form. Others believe that the weathering and erosion are part of the monument's history and should be left untouched. Both positions have merit. The rebuilding argument goes like this. If we don't restore damaged sections of the Sphinx will eventually collapse. Better to replace a few stones now than to lose the entire monument later. And if we use appropriate materials and document everything we do, future scholars will be able to distinguish original stone from modern repairs. The preservation argument counters. Every intervention changes the monument. Once you start replacing stones, where do you stop? At what point does the Sphinx stop being an ancient monument and become a modern reconstruction? And what if our restoration techniques turn out to be wrong? We could be causing damage while thinking we're preventing it. Both sides cite the Venice Charter, an international agreement on conservation principles adopted in 1964. The charter states that restoration should be minimal, reversible when possible, and clearly distinguishable from the original. But applying these principles to a crumbling 5,000-year-old limestone monument is incredibly difficult. Current practice tries to find a middle ground. Stabilize what's actively failing, prevent further deterioration, but don't try to make the monument look new. Accept the damage as part of its history. This approach requires constant monitoring and periodic small interventions rather than major restoration campaigns. It's not dramatic, it's not exciting, it's just careful, ongoing maintenance, which is appropriate for a monument that has already survived this long. Slow and steady is probably the right approach. Let's talk about new technologies being applied to Sphinx research, because the tools available to archaeologists have improved dramatically in recent years. High-resolution photogrammetry allows researchers to create detailed 3D models of the Sphinx from thousands of photographs. These models can be studied, measured, and analyzed without physically touching the monument. You can examine erosion patterns, calculate volumes, detect structural changes over time, all from a computer. Multispectral imaging can reveal details invisible to the naked eye. By photographing the Sphinx in different wavelengths of light, including ultraviolet and infrared, researchers can see traces of paint, detect differences in stone composition, and identify areas of previous repair. This technology has been used on other Egyptian monuments with great success. Ground-penetrating radar keeps improving. Modern systems can detect much smaller anomalies at greater depths than the equipment used in the 1990s. If there are chambers beneath the Sphinx, current technology has a better chance of finding them. But again, detection isn't the same as excavation. You still need permission to dig, and that permission has not been granted. LiDAR, or light detection and ranging, uses laser scanners to create incredibly precise measurements of surfaces. LiDAR surveys of the Sphinx have produced millimeter-accurate maps of every crack, crevice, and contour. This data is invaluable for monitoring changes over time and planning conservation work. There's also been progress in understanding ancient stoneworking techniques. Experimental archaeologists have recreated the tools and methods used by ancient Egyptian masons, demonstrating that the precision we see in monuments like the Sphinx could absolutely have been achieved with copper tools, wooden mallets, and stone pounders. No lost technology required, just skill and time. These experiments are important because they counter the claims of alternative historians who insist that ancient monuments required advanced technology. When you can demonstrate that ancient techniques work, the mystery disappears. Or at least it becomes a different kind of mystery. Not how was this possible, but how did they develop such sophisticated techniques with such simple tools? The answer, as always, is practice. The Egyptians had been working with stone for thousands of years before they carved the Sphinx. They understood their materials. They knew how limestone behaved, how it split, how it could be shaped. This knowledge was passed down through generations of craftsmen, refined and perfected over centuries. We've lost that knowledge now. Modern stonemasons don't spend decades learning to carve limestone by hand because we have power tools. But the ancient Egyptians didn't have a choice. Stone carving was their technology, so they got very, very good at it. There's something humbling about that. We tend to assume that older equals more primitive, that ancient people were less capable than we are. But in many ways, they were more skilled. They had to be. Their survival depended on it. Let's talk about the Sphinx in the age of social media, because the monument has entered a new phase of its existence as a backdrop for selfies and Instagram posts. Every day, thousands of photos of the Sphinx are uploaded to social media platforms. People pose in front of it, next to it, pretending to kiss it or hold it in their palm through perspective tricks. The Sphinx has become a performance space, a setting for personal branding and digital memory making. This isn't necessarily bad. People have always wanted mementos of their travels. In the 19th century, they commissioned paintings or bought postcards. In the 20th century, they took photographs. Now they take selfies and share them online. The impulse is the same, only the technology has changed. But there's something qualitatively different about social media engagement. The monument becomes secondary to the person in front of it. The Sphinx isn't the subject of the photo. It's a prop, a marker of status and experience. Look where I went. Look what I saw. Tour guides at Giza report that many visitors spend more time photographing themselves with the Sphinx than actually looking at the monument. They arrive, take photos, and leave, sometimes within minutes. The experience is mediated entirely through their phone screens. Again, this isn't unique to the Sphinx. It's happening at famous sites all over the world. The Eiffel Tower, the Taj Mahal, Machu Picchu, everywhere. The phenomenon has a name, over-tourism, and it's changing how we relate to heritage sites. But it also means the Sphinx is more visible than ever before. Millions of people who will never visit Egypt still see images of the Sphinx regularly in their social media feeds. It's part of global visual culture in a way that wouldn't have been possible even 20 years ago. The Sphinx has always been famous, but now its fame is democratized. It's not just scholars and wealthy travelers who know about it. It's everyone with an internet connection. Whether this familiarity breeds appreciation or indifference is hard to say. Let's drift towards some final thoughts about what the Sphinx means, or could mean, or maybe doesn't mean at all. The Sphinx is, at its most basic level, a damaged statue. Limestone carved into a specific shape, weathered by time and environment, sitting in a desert. That's the physical reality. Everything else is interpretation. But humans need interpretation. We need things to mean something. A pile of carved rocks isn't enough. We want narrative, symbolism, connection to something larger than ourselves. So we project meaning onto the Sphinx. We turn it into a symbol. For the ancient Egyptians, it symbolized royal power and divine protection. For medieval Arabs, it was a remnant of a pagan past, possibly dangerous, possibly valuable. For Renaissance Europeans, it was evidence of ancient wisdom. For Romantic poets, it was a meditation on mortality and empire. For Victorian archaeologists, it was a scientific puzzle. For New Age mystics, it's a spiritual beacon. For tourists, it's a photo opportunity. All of these interpretations exist simultaneously. The Sphinx contains multitudes. It can be whatever we need it to be, which is part of why it endures in our imagination. But the monument itself remains indifferent to our interpretations. It doesn't care what we think it means. It just sits there, slowly eroding, utterly unconcerned with human opinions. There's something comforting about that indifference. In a world where everything is contested and politicized, the Sphinx simply exists. Some researchers believe the Sphinx was designed to last forever, a monument to eternal kingship. Others think it was just a product of its time, never intended to survive millennia. Both could be true. The builders might have hoped for immortality, knowing nothing lasts forever. What's certain is that the Sphinx has outlived its creators by thousands of years. Everyone who designed it, carved it, maintained it, worshipped at it, all of them are dust now. Their names, most of them, are forgotten, but their work remains, or at least a weathered version of it. In a few thousand more years, the Sphinx might be gone. The limestone might erode completely, the head might finally collapse, the body might be reduced to a shapeless mound. Or maybe not. Maybe conservation efforts will succeed. Maybe the Sphinx will still be standing when our civilization is the one being excavated and studied. Either way, it's a reminder of scale. Human lives are short. Monuments are long. But geological time is longer still. From the perspective of the Earth, even the Sphinx is temporary. The limestone it's carved from was deposited 300 million years ago. It will erode back into sand and dust. Everything does, eventually. This could be depressing, but I find it peaceful. The Sphinx has been through so much. Buried and excavated repeatedly, painted and worn bare, worshipped and vandalized, studied and mythologized, and through it all, it endures, mostly unchanged, still staring at the sunrise. We could learn something from that. Not the endurance, necessarily, because the Sphinx isn't trying to endure. It's just being what it is, a piece of carved stone, subject to the same forces of entropy as everything else. But there's dignity in that, in existing without striving, in being present without needing to be understood. The mysteries remain. We still don't know exactly when it was built. We still don't know who built it or why. We still don't know if there are chambers beneath it. We still don't know what happened to the nose, not with absolute certainty. And that's fine. Not everything needs to be solved. Some mysteries are valuable precisely because they're unsolved. They keep us curious. They remind us that the past is not a closed book. There are still blank pages, still questions without answers. The Sphinx will continue to be studied. New technologies will be applied. New theories will be proposed. Some old theories will be proven wrong. Some might be vindicated. The conversation will continue, generation after generation, as long as the monument stands and humans care about the past. For now, the Sphinx sits in its enclosure, surrounded by tourists and archaeologists and vendors selling postcards. The sun rises in front of it every morning, just as it has for thousands of years. The limestone continues its slow dissolution. The conservation teams monitor and repair, and the mysteries remain, patient and silent, waiting. Let that image rest in your mind. The Sphinx at dawn, golden light illuminating its weathered features, the desert stretching out in all directions, quiet except for the wind. Eternal morning, endless patience, time moving slowly, as it always does in the desert.
The Sphinx and human memory. Before we finish, let's think about what the Sphinx tells us about memory, both collective and individual, and how we preserve meaning across vast stretches of time. The Sphinx is often described as a guardian of the Giza Plateau, watching over the pyramids. But what is it actually guarding? The pyramids don't need protection. They're just stone. The treasures inside them were looted thousands of years ago. The pharaohs buried there are long gone, their mummies scattered across museums or lost entirely. Maybe the Sphinx guards something more abstract. Memory, perhaps. The memory of a civilization that built monuments intended to last forever, or at least to outlast the individuals who commissioned them. In that sense, the Sphinx has succeeded. We remember ancient Egypt, even if our memory is fragmentary and often wrong. But memory is tricky. It degrades over time, just like limestone. Details are lost. Stories get embellished. Facts blend with fiction. The Sphinx we imagine is not quite the same as the Sphinx that exists.
And the Sphinx that exists now is not the same as the Sphinx that was originally carved. Every restoration changes it slightly. Every tourist who touches it wears away a microscopic layer. Every photograph frames it differently. The Sphinx is constantly being recreated, physically and conceptually, by everyone who interacts with it. This is true of all historical monuments, but it's especially visible with the Sphinx because the monument itself is so ambiguous. There's no definitive text telling us what it meant. We have to infer, interpret, guess. And in doing so, we inevitably project our own concerns and values onto it. Ancient Egyptians saw the Sphinx as a manifestation of divine power. Medieval Muslims saw it as a relic of ignorance and idolatry. European colonizers saw it as evidence of a mysterious Orient waiting to be cataloged and controlled. Modern Egyptians see it as a symbol of national heritage and pride. Future generations will see it through whatever lens their own culture provides. None of these views is objectively correct. They're all culturally conditioned. But they're all real in the sense that they shape how the Sphinx is treated, studied, and preserved. The monument exists in dialogue with whoever is looking at it. There's a philosophical question lurking here. Is the Sphinx the physical object, the carved limestone, or is it the idea of the Sphinx, the accumulated meanings and associations that have built up over millennia? Can you separate the two? Probably not. The physical and the conceptual are intertwined. The stone gives weight and permanence to the idea. The idea gives significance to the stone. Without one, the other loses much of its power. This is why conservation matters. It's not just about preserving rock, it's about preserving a link to the past, a physical connection to people who lived thousands of years ago. When you stand in front of the Sphinx, you're looking at something those people made with their own hands. They touched this stone. They shaped it. That connection is profound, even if we don't know their names or fully understand their motives. It's also why the debates about the Sphinx's age and origin matter to people, even though they can sometimes seem academic and abstract. These aren't just technical questions about archaeology. They're questions about who we are and where we come from. If the Sphinx is older than we thought, it means human civilization is older than we thought. It means we need to revise our understanding of history. That's significant. Of course, most of the evidence still points to the traditional dating. The Sphinx was probably built in the Old Kingdom, probably by Khafre, probably around 2500 BC. But the fact that we can still say probably rather than definitely is important. It means we're being honest about the limits of our knowledge. It means we're leaving room for new discoveries. Science works best when it's open to revision. When new evidence appears, good scientists adjust their theories accordingly. The problem comes when people confuse caution with certainty, or when they mistake speculation for fact. The Sphinx has suffered from both tendencies. Some Egyptologists speak too confidently about things that are genuinely uncertain, dismissing alternative theories without fully engaging with the evidence. Some alternative researchers make wild claims based on flimsy evidence, then cry conspiracy when mainstream scholars don't take them seriously. Both extremes are unhelpful. The truth, as usual, is somewhere in the middle. We know some things about the Sphinx with reasonable certainty. We don't know other things, and that's okay. Being uncertain doesn't mean being ignorant. It means being honest about what the evidence supports and what it doesn't. Let's think about the future of Sphinx research. What questions remain? What might we still discover? The chambers beneath the Sphinx are the obvious target. If they exist, and if they could be excavated safely without damaging the monument, they might contain artifacts, inscriptions, or structural evidence that could resolve some of the dating questions. But that's a big if. The Egyptian authorities are understandably cautious about invasive exploration. Advanced imaging technologies might help. If we could develop a way to see beneath the Sphinx with enough resolution to distinguish natural cavities from artificial chambers, we could at least know what we're dealing with before committing to excavation. But current technology isn't quite there yet.
There's also the possibility of finding new texts or inscriptions that mention the Sphinx. Egypt is still being excavated. New papyri are discovered regularly.
It's possible that somewhere in a tomb or temple, there's a document that definitively states who built the Sphinx and when. It hasn't been found yet, but it might exist. Climate science might also contribute. If we could better understand the climate history of the Giza Plateau, we could more accurately assess the weathering patterns on the Sphinx. This might help resolve the water erosion debate. But climate reconstruction is complex and uncertain, especially for periods thousands of years ago. Ultimately, some questions might never be answered. The Sphinx might keep its secrets forever. And that's okay. Mystery is not a failure of scholarship, it's a recognition of limits. We've done what we can with the evidence available. Future researchers might do better, or they might not. Either way, the effort is worthwhile. The Sphinx teaches patience. It's been sitting there for thousands of years. It can wait a few more centuries for us to figure things out, if we ever do. There's a certain humility in studying something this old and this enigmatic. It reminds you that you're part of a conversation that started long before you were born and will continue long after you're gone. Your contribution might be small. You might not solve the great mysteries, but you add your voice to the ongoing dialogue between past and present. That's what historians and archaeologists do, really. They maintain the conversation. They preserve memory. They ask questions on behalf of cultures that can no longer speak for themselves. It's important work, even when it doesn't yield definitive answers. The Sphinx has been part of this conversation for as long as humans have been writing about monuments. Ancient Greek historians mentioned it. Roman travelers described it. Arab scholars cataloged it. European explorers sketched it. Modern researchers scan, measure, and analyze it, and the conversation continues. What will future generations say about the Sphinx? What technologies will they bring to bear on it? What questions will they ask that we haven't thought of yet? We can't know, but we can be reasonably certain they'll still be asking questions. The Sphinx inspires curiosity in a way that few monuments do. Part of that is the mystery. Part of it is the sheer presence of the thing, but part of it is something harder to define. There's a quality to the Sphinx that invites contemplation. Maybe it's the human face on the lion body, the combination of intelligence and strength. Maybe it's the way it stares perpetually eastward, always watching the sunrise, never looking away. Maybe it's just the accumulation of centuries of human attention and projection. Whatever it is, it works. People continue to be fascinated, continue to speculate, continue to wonder. And really, that's enough. The Sphinx doesn't need to yield all its secrets. It just needs to continue inspiring questions. As long as it does that, it's fulfilling whatever purpose it was originally given, even if that purpose has been forgotten. Let's bring this to a close gently, the way we started, with an invitation to rest and reflect. The Sphinx sits in the desert, weathered and worn, missing its nose, patched and repaired countless times, slowly dissolving back into the sand it was carved from. It's not perfect, it's not pristine, it's damaged and aging and will eventually be gone. But for now, it endures, a monument to ambition, to craftsmanship, to the very human desire to create something that will outlast us. The people who built it achieved that goal. Their names might be lost, but their work remains. Every morning, the sun rises in front of the Sphinx. Light spills across the desert, illuminating the weathered limestone, casting shadows in the deep erosion channels, warming stone that has been warming in the same sunlight for thousands of years. The Sphinx doesn't move, doesn't speak, doesn't reveal its secrets. It just sits, patient and silent, wearing away one grain of sand at a time, indifferent to our questions and theories. And somehow, that indifference is comforting. In a world of constant change and uncertainty, the Sphinx remains mostly the same, year after year, century after century, millennium after millennium, still there, still watching the sunrise, still keeping its mysteries. You can visit it if you want, stand in its shadow, touch the limestone, feel the roughness of the weathered surface, take your photograph, add your voice to the millions who have stood in the same spot and wondered. Or you can just think about it from wherever you are. Picture it in your mind, the great lion body, the human face, the empty eyes staring east. Let the image settle. Let it rest. The Sphinx has time. It's been waiting for thousands of years. It can wait a little longer. And so can you. Let that thought carry you gently into whatever comes next. Sleep, perhaps, or quiet contemplation, or just a peaceful moment before you return to the noise of daily life. The Sphinx will still be there tomorrow, and the day after, and for many days to come, slowly weathering, slowly changing, but fundamentally the same. A mystery in stone, a question without an answer, a monument to the endurance of human creativity and the inevitable passage of time. Rest now. The desert is quiet. The sun is setting or rising depending on where you are, and the Sphinx, as always, watches and waits. This concludes our journey through the hidden secrets of the Sphinx. Thank you for spending this time wandering through ancient mysteries and modern uncertainties. May your sleep be peaceful and your dreams free of unsolved riddles. Good night.